At 0200 hours local time, a warhead tore through the steel skin of a fuel tank car standing in the marshalling yard at Salsk. The drone that carried it had crossed roughly 250 miles of Russian territory to reach that one rail car. Coupled behind it were a second tank car and the locomotive, together holding something close to 31,000 gallons of fuel bound for the front. The vapor caught first. Then the fire column climbed close to 400 feet above the rail yard, and people 9 miles out could see the glow from their windows. Salsk is not a frontline town. It is a railway junction in the southeast corner of Rostov Oblast, and for the Russian army it is one of the most valuable pieces of ground in the south. The main line down from Rostov effectively ends here before the traffic turns west toward occupied Donetsk and Luhansk, and south toward the crossings that feed Crimea. Ammunition, spare parts, armored vehicles, and above all fuel move through this junction. One loaded fuel train carries what would otherwise take about 100 road tankers and 100 drivers to move. Salsk sits roughly 250 miles behind the fighting. That distance is the whole reason it was treated as rear area, and that is where the trap was built, though not at Salsk itself. The line feeding this junction is electrified. An electric locomotive carries no fuel of its own. It draws current from the contact wire strung above the track, and that current comes from traction substations spaced along the corridor. Cut a substation and the wire goes dead. A train under a dead wire does not slow down, and it does not divert. It stops where it stands. 2 nights earlier, drones hit the traction substation at Zhutovo, up the line in Volgograd Oblast. On the night of the strike itself, a second substation went down at Dvoynaya, near Orlovsky, 35 miles from Salsk, and part of the same power district that feeds the junction. Open-source analysts later mapped all 3 strikes as a single sequence, so by the time the loaded fuel train rolled into the yard at Salsk, the corridor ahead of it had no power. It braked, and it waited for a line that was never going to clear. Around it, the summer timetable carried on as if nothing had changed. Passenger service still running south toward the coast, crews treating a stopped train as a delay, the way crews have treated stopped trains for 100 years. The thing holding that train in place was not at Salsk at all. It was 35 miles away, and it had been burning since the night before. The drones came in low across the Rostov steppe, and the steppe is what made it possible. Flat, open, almost featureless. The kind of ground where a machine flying 60 feet up disappears not because it is hidden, but because everything behind it is also 60 feet up. Fields, tree lines, farm buildings, grain elevators, radar energy that goes out and comes back from that terrain returns as noise, and somewhere inside that noise are the returns from a propeller-driven aircraft with a wingspan not much wider than a car. But the machines were only the delivery. The work had been done 2 nights earlier, on a target that no air defense commander in Rostov Oblast would have lost sleep over. A traction substation is a fenced lot. Transformers, switchgear, a control building, a chain-link gate with a padlock and a warning sign. It takes power off the national grid, converts it, and pushes it into the contact wire strung above the rails. One substation carries a stretch of corridor measured in tens of miles, and along a line like Volgograd to Salsk, there are only so many of them. They are not manned by soldiers. They do not shoot back, they do not appear on a target list because target lists are written by what looks dangerous, and a transformer yard looks like nothing at all. It is the fuse box of the corridor, unremarkable, unguarded, and holding up everything that moves above it. Which is why the arithmetic runs the wrong way for the defender. Repairing a damaged traction substation is measured in days. Parts have to come from somewhere else on the network, and there is no spare sitting in a shed nearby. But a loaded fuel train that stops moving becomes a fixed target in the time it takes to set the brakes. Days to fix. And in the time it takes a repair crew to be told which substation went down, a drone launched from the Ukrainian side has already covered the last 40 miles of its route. Zhutovo went down on the 27th. Dvoynaya, 35 miles from Salsk and inside the same power district, went down on the night of the 29th, and the corridor south stopped conducting. none of which means Salsk itself was open ground. Rail junctions of that value in southern Russia sit inside a point defense umbrella, and the system built for exactly this job is the Pantsir S-1, a wheeled vehicle carrying its own radar, its own missiles, and a pair of automatic cannon, designed to stand over a fixed site and kill anything small that comes at it. On paper, it is very good at the problem. It is meant to engage low, slow, cheap targets. It is meant to react in seconds rather than minutes. It is the answer the Russian air defense network developed specifically because drones like these exist. The trouble is what it can see and when. A radar mounted on a vehicle is a few feet off the ground. Against a target flying at 60 feet over flat steppe, the useful detection range collapses. Not because the radar is weak, but because the Earth curves and the clutter piles up. The system ends up watching a narrow band of sky at the exact altitude where the returns are worst. It is like watching traffic through a mail slot. The road is there, the cars are there, and you get a fraction of a second of each one as it crosses the gap. Now put numbers against that. Suppose the first stable return comes at 6 miles. A drone at roughly 105 miles an hour is covering about 150 feet every second, which gives the crew somewhere near 3.5 minutes from first return to arrival. That sounds like plenty. It is not, because those minutes are not spent shooting. They are spent deciding, separating a real return from ground clutter, confirming it is not a bird or a reflection off a moving vehicle, holding it long enough to build a track, and getting the mount around onto a bearing. Every second spent on that question is another 150 feet the drone has already taken off the total. And when the returns are coming in and dropping out through a mail slot, the deciding is the hard part. Somewhere south of Volgograd, the machines were still coming, 60 feet up, holding a heading, 40 minutes out. Nothing about the next 40 minutes depended on what happened over Salsk. But the deeper problem was never the radar, it was the map. Air defense is allocated the way insurance is written, against what is expensive and against what is obviously worth attacking. A rail junction moving fuel to 3 occupied regions is expensive and obvious, so a junction gets an umbrella. An airfield gets an umbrella. A refinery gets an umbrella. The assets are ranked, the batteries are distributed down the ranking, and the ranking is built on what each site is worth. Follow that logic along the Volgograd-Salsk corridor and the substations never appear. A transformer yard is worth a rounding error next to a loaded fuel train. It holds nothing, moves nothing, and produces nothing a planner would put on a board. By every measure the allocation uses, it is the least valuable thing on the line. It is also the thing everything else on the line is standing on. That inversion is the vulnerability, and it is structural rather than tactical. A corridor of this length runs on a chain of substations spaced along it, unmanned and behind ordinary fencing. Covering each one the way the junction is covered would mean pushing point defense vehicles out to dozens of sites that, individually, are worth less than the vehicle assigned to guard them. No army allocates that way. No army can. So the defense is concentrated where the value is concentrated, over the junction, over the trains, over the yard, while the current that lets any of it move arrives from a fenced lot 35 miles away with nothing standing over it. Ukraine did not find a hole in the Pantsir umbrella. It stepped around the edge of it. There is no confirmed record of what the Pantsir batteries around Salsk did that night, or whether they engaged at all. Russian air defense systems are documented in the region. What happened in those specific minutes is not. What is documented is the outcome. And the outcome was complicated by something sitting in the yard that had nothing to do with the war. Passenger train number 59, Novokuznetsk to Kislovodsk, was in Salsk station. It was the end of July, the middle of the southern holiday season, and the summer timetable was running full. Whatever else was true about that rail yard, it was not a clean military target with a fence around it. Loaded tank cars on one set of tracks, sleeping cars full of holidaymakers a few hundred feet away on another. That is the part of the night that does not fit the usual story. This was not a strike where the aim point could be approximate and the result would still be acceptable. The difference between hitting the objective and hitting something else entirely came down to which row of rolling stock the terminal guidance settled on in the last seconds, a distance shorter than the length of the train itself. The tank cars were hit, 2 of them, and the locomotive. Number 59 came out of it with broken windows in 2 cars, and its passengers were walked off, held clear, and eventually put back aboard. Then the fire did what fuel fires do. The first warhead opened the tank car rather than destroying it. That is the whole mechanism. A punctured tank does not explode, it vents. Fuel comes out under its own pressure, hits air, and turns to vapor faster than it can drain, and the vapor cloud is what burns. The ignition ran back to the breech, and the tank car went from a steel cylinder to a column of flame in less time than it takes to read the sentence. Heat moved outward. The second tank car, coupled directly behind, sat inside that heat, with its own pressure rising and its own relief valves lifting, feeding the fire it was standing in. The locomotive took damage at the head of the consist. Burning fuel ran down between the rails and along the ballast, and the yard filled with the kind of black smoke that does not rise cleanly but rolls. And then the fire climbed. Above every track in that yard, at roughly 20 feet, ran the contact wire. The same overhead system that carries the current, the same system whose substations had been struck 2 nights and 1 night before. Copper under tension, directly above a fuel fire. It came down. Russian railways confirmed damage to the overhead lines, and traffic through Salsk stopped entirely. 45 firefighters and 12 vehicles went to work on it. The corridor had been cut upstream to hold the train in place. Now it was cut at the junction itself, by the train. By the time the fire crews had it under control, the ledger at Salsk read like this. 2 fuel tank cars burned out. The locomotive at the head of the consist damaged. The overhead contact wire above the yard brought down. Traffic through the junction stopped completely. Not slowed, not rerouted, stopped. While 45 firefighters and 12 vehicles worked the yard. Then the second ledger, the one that took longer to show up. 18 passenger trains delayed, some of them by as much as 7 hours, on a line running full in the last week of July. Thousands of people sitting in stopped carriages across southern Russia, several hundred miles from any front, waiting on a junction that could not pass traffic. The Russian Defense Ministry stated that its forces downed 74 drones that night, 22 of them over Rostov Oblast. That figure comes from one side and has not been independently confirmed. What matters is what the strike was aimed at, because it was not really aimed at a train. Salsk was the 4th strike on rail infrastructure in Rostov Oblast in a single month. Read one at a time, each looks like a raid. A fire, a delay, a cleanup crew. Read together. With Zhutovo and Dvoynaya on the same map, they stop looking like raids and start looking like a campaign against a single corridor. The line that carries fuel and materiel from Volgograd down through Rostov and out to Donetsk, Luhansk, and the crossings toward Crimea. A depot can be emptied. An airfield can move its aircraft. A rail corridor runs where a century of construction put it, and every ton that reaches the front reaches it by rail. So the pressure compounds. Damage a substation and the trains stop. Stop the trains and they stack up at junctions. Stack them at junctions, and every one of them becomes what the train at Salsk became. Stationary, loaded, and precisely where everyone knows to look. The corridor does not have to be destroyed. It only has to be made unreliable. And unreliable is a condition an army fights with for months. None of this required destroying a mile of track. Not a single rail at Salsk needed to be cut. The rails are still there tonight, straight and intact, running exactly where they ran a week earlier. What was taken away was the current above them and the confidence underneath them, and a railway that cannot be relied on has already stopped being a railway. Which raises a question worth arguing about in the comments. Across this war, which has cost Russia more, strikes on the fuel itself or strikes on the infrastructure that moves it? The refineries get the headlines. The transformer yards get nothing. Tell me which one you think actually hurts more and why. If you want more breakdowns like this one, the systems, the sequencing, and the reasoning behind them rather than just the footage, subscribe, and we will keep taking these apart one at a time.